Welcome to Lesson 8 in Module 223, Advanced Ethics. And this is our last batch of principles. We're going to look at 3, and the 3 of them are usually considered to be pretty simple by most people, and that's true. But at the same time, I notice that folks sometimes get the 3 of them mixed up or confused. So let's take a look at them. The first is something most of us refer to as safety. And safety actually has 2 components to it. The first is called mitigation of risk. Mitigation is just a fancy way of saying minimization. And what it should probably say is mitigation of unnecessary risk, because as we talked about earlier, there are times we would actually allow or even support people to be engaged in dignifying risks. But even then, we wouldn't do it in a careless way. So when we mitigate risk, we go around and we look for instances where there's unnecessary risk. For example, let's say we notice that there's an electrical cord in a group home that has grown frayed. We should probably throw it away. Or if we haven't scraped the ice off of the parking lot. Mitigation of risk simply means that we take away as much risk as we can. But we're not just going to take away risk or avoid risk. We have what's called a duty of care. We talked about that in our Ethics of Abuse and Neglect module. The duty of care states that we have to do certain things. We have to do what a person would reasonably do to provide for the health and welfare of the people we're supported. That involves prevention, that involves specific caregiving activities, that involves following through on people's care plans, that involves collaborating with other medical professionals and following medical advice. All of those things are part of this duty of care. But up to this point, we've talked about safety purely from a physical standpoint, and we really shouldn't just talk about it that way. In our Ethics of Abuse course, we also talked about financial abuse, and that's an important thing for us to consider because we can truly put people in harm's way if we do not take care of their money. But there's a third one that we've never talked about before, and that's the reputation of people and agencies. These two are part of what we must maintain with a high degree of safety. If we're out in the community and we're divulging information or saying things that are untrue that could cause our employer, for example, to have harm, then we are violating this principle. Our whole aim here is to take reasonable precautions. We are not being unsafe just because somebody has been hurt. People get hurt even in safe environments, even when others have done reasonable things. And the opposite is equally true. An unsafe practice is unsafe even if we do not see somebody get injured. If we're lucky, somebody might notice it and remedy the problem before it results in injury. But if we have evidence that somebody's been behaving in an unsafe way, we should act and consider it to be unethical at that point. So we used an example in a previous module of a bus driver, a school bus driver, who was mandated to inspect the brakes of the school bus, but chose not to do that. Even if that school bus driver had been driving for years with uninspected brakes, that doesn't mean that that school driver has been ethical. Every single time they pulled out, they were breaking their ethics. The next principle we want to talk about is effectiveness. Effectiveness simply means that we have to do things that create a reasonable expectation of success. Let's pretend for a moment that you take your car to a garage. When you get there, you tell the mechanic that your brakes are failing, and you ask the mechanic to fix them. You come back a few hours later, and the mechanic tells you that the brakes have been fixed. You jump in the car, and you drive along. After a while, you hit the brakes. All of a sudden, the car just completely skids through an intersection, and you have an accident. In fact, the only thing that you noticed that was different between the way the car behaved before you went in and after was that it actually seemed to stop more poorly and made no noise. Back to the mechanic you go. Hey, you say, how come my car didn't stop? The mechanic says, well, I put oil on the brakes to stop the squeaking noises. That mechanic has behaved in a way that's unethical. Even though that would help to get rid of the squeaking noise, every competent mechanic knows that putting oil on your brakes is going to make them work more poorly, not better. There's no reasonable expectation of success. So there are lots of examples of this. And again, we're allowed to make mistakes. We're allowed to not be perfect. We're allowed to have given it a good and reasonable try and have somebody else come along and do it better than we do. But what we're not allowed to do is things that we know will not be successful. Even if they might be successful in the short term, in the long term, if we know that they're going to cause more trouble than benefit, then we shouldn't do them. We also have an important practice here called review and revise, meaning that we don't just assume that things are working. We actually have to go back and check our work and make revisions or adjustments as time passes. And we shouldn't just do that once. It should be a routine part of our practice. And thirdly, we're going to learn the principle of efficiency. Efficiency means that we should avoid unnecessary waste. Waste can be of things like money, staff time, individual emotions such as the investment emotionally of a family or a supported person, equipment or spaces, especially those that wear out. All of these things are things that are considered resources. And when we do something, we know it's going to consume resources. But we should not do it in a way that consumes an unnecessarily high amount of resources. Now there's room here for decision making. Let's give you another scenario. You have been asked to go out and buy computers for your school. You get two different quotes. In one case, the computers cost less to buy, but you can tell from doing some homework and reading reviews that they'll last about 4 years. In another instance, you can see that the computers will cost about 1.5 times the other bid, but they're also going to last 6 or 7 years, and so they'll be better quality. It's really quite up to you to be able to decide which of those represents the better decision. You can make an argument that each of them have advantages in terms of efficiency. But what wouldn't be acceptable is if you went out and you tried to buy computers and you didn't do any homework at all. You went down to the local store and you just plunked down the money and you bought the most expensive computers that existed. Or even if you got lucky, not necessarily the most expensive, but you didn't do any work to prove that they weren't the most expensive. Efficiency says that you have to do your homework to try and avoid unnecessary waste. A little bit of waste is expected, and once again, sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes we're cooking a meal and it gets burnt and it has to be thrown away. So that happens. But when we purposely go out, let's say, cook a meal for people, knowing that they won't eat it, we're wasting our time, we're wasting money, we're wasting food, and that's a violation of this principle. Let's do some cases. And these are all, believe it or not, taken from real life. I'm going to tell you 4 stories, and then I want you to pause and think about which of the principles applies. And I only want you to think about the 3 in this video, which are safety, effectiveness, and efficiency. So, in the first story, we call it hope for coffee. This was a common practice in one of the agencies where I used to work, especially what happened on Monday mornings. People would come in after a weekend of partying, the staff people, and they would say, I don't have much energy today. Why don't we go to Hope, or sometimes Squamish, for coffee? And what they meant was, let's put all the supported people into a van and drive for 3 or 4 hours in our shift. And really that will mean that we don't have to do a lot. The individuals we're supporting will probably fall asleep in the vehicle. They won't get anything out of it either, but the time will pass. All right, so that's your first one. The second one, an individual goes to a grocery store in the summertime, but it's going to be a lot of work if they go into the grocery store with a supported person because that person's very slow. And they only need to get 1 or 2 things. So what they decide to do is leave the individual sitting in the hot car. They run into the grocery store and buy the items without the individual, leaving that person unsupervised. The third one is take the long way home. We're out on an outing and there's a few hours between the end of the day and this particular portion of the day. Staff people have been out on an outing and really can't think of something else that we should do. So they decide to take a long drive home. It's not necessarily clear that the supported people don't want to do this and the drive is kind of scenic, but we're not really doing anything that is going to be terribly instructive or constructive. And finally, in the 4th example, a staff person comes on shift and they're working with somebody that they know can have troubling behavior. They also know this person has diabetes and as a result tends to have their snacks restricted. So the staff person has a special treat they offer to the individual at the beginning of every shift, saying that if their behavior is going to be really good, they'll give them a chocolate bar at the end of the shift. So the other thing you need to know about this scenario is that this person knows that nobody else in the agency is doing this. And as a result, when other people come on shift and don't have chocolate bars to offer, the person tends to behave very poorly for those other people. Let's see how you did. Pause and take a look at the next slide when you're done. All right. In the first scenario, taking the folks to Hope or Squamish wasn't unsafe. It was, however, both inefficient and ineffective. The employer is not asking us to use our time, our money, or the van so that we can go and just pass time. We are literally going out with the intention of wasting time. And we know that what we're doing is simply not going to help the people we're supporting achieve their goals or enrich their life in any way. So we know it's going to be ineffective. And in fact, these days would often lead to people having behavioral problems or falling asleep in the vehicle, and therefore we get reports from the home that the person didn't sleep later on. So it was definitely not efficient or effective. What about the client being left in the hot car? Well, not only were they being left in a hot car, but they're being left unsupervised, and clearly both of those things are unsafe. And people are supposed to be engaged in their own lives. So the fact that it was going to be a little bit slower to take the person into the store was not a concern. In fact, one could argue that this staff person was ineffective because they were too focused on efficiency. They wanted to not waste time, but they wouldn't have wasted time even if they'd gone slower. The whole purpose of taking the person to the store is to teach the person how to shop and give them an opportunity for community exposure. What about take the long way home? Well, in this particular instance, you might have been tempted to say it was ineffective, but I threw a little curveball in there. I said that we didn't know for a fact that the supported individuals didn't enjoy it or weren't getting anything out of it. What I did say is there wasn't a lot of value in it, and that's what makes it inefficient. I was just simply wasting time. And finally, the last one, you probably caught that it was unsafe to give chocolate to a person with diabetes. But did you also notice that it was ineffective? And by the way, I kind of enriched this story a bit because the person was actively acting out in my story for other people. But the individual who did this claimed they didn't know that, and that still wasn't justification, because any reasonable CSW would know that what they were doing was likely to cause misbehavior and conflict for all of the other people working other shifts. So it was both ineffective and unsafe. But the chocolate bars came from the staff person. There was no evidence that anything was wasted, and so it did not violate the third principle. Don't be don't be upset if you're having a little bit of difficulty delineating these, particularly the concepts of ineffective and inefficient. Unfortunately, the two of them both start with the same 5 letters, which only makes them more easy to get conflicted. But it's possible to be inefficient and effective, and it's possible to be ineffective and efficient. In the case of the person being left in the car, the staff person was extremely efficient with her time, but she was ineffective. So it's really important to understand this. We can waste things and still be successful, and we can avoid wasting things and sometimes not be successful. All right, now we're finished with all of the principles. Let's see how well you do in approaching 3 different cases. In each case, I'll present the case, ask you to pause the video and see how you did. You can restart the video to find the answers from every question immediately after. In case number 1, Bob secretly invites his girlfriend to join himself and some supported individuals on an outing. Bob's a staff person. What principles did he violate? Pause and answer. Hopefully some of the things that you noticed was that Bob was doing this secretly, which means he violated the principle of accountability. And he was being inefficient. He's not supposed to be taking his time to be with his girlfriend. There's no evidence, by the way, that he wasn't effective. Maybe the supportive people love his girlfriend, and he was in a conflict of interest. Because it was secret, you could tell he had not declared it to somebody else. If Bob's girlfriend, for example, was a former staff person and the supported individuals loved her, then it might be a great idea to bring her along, in which case Bob should probably ask his supervisor if it's a good idea, and now all of these problems are probably gone. By the way, you might have also questioned his honesty, and I think you have a good, valid concern here. However, it doesn't say that he lied about it. He was never asked about it. He simply hid it. And typically when we talk about dishonesty, we're talking about lying. But you could make an argument. Number 2 case. Mike said that he had first aid, but he let it lapse last week. He then did CPR on one of the supported people named Ron. What principles were violated? We talked about one very similar before. How did you do? You probably noticed, because we talked about it before, that what was really wrong here is that Mike did not have a current CPR certificate, but he did CPR, so we can tell that it was not an issue of safety. However, we can tell that he wasn't being completely accountable, again, and we can see that he probably doesn't have the integrity that he should. He should have acted in a certain way. Just because other people didn't notice that he had let it lapse wasn't enough. So, while he wasn't dishonest in the classic sense, he didn't possess integrity. You remember in the first example, I said that Bob had not lied, but what he didn't do is demonstrate integrity, and that could have applied to case 1 as well. Now, case 3. Andy unilaterally decided to put Michelle on a vegetarian diet. He's not an expert, and he didn't tell her he was going to do it. Later on, though, he admitted it. Pause and see how many different principles you can identify in this case that were violated. Also, you might be curious to see whether or not there are any examples here of principles that were upheld. So, Andy does not possess the expertise, or the competency is another way of putting this. So he's violated the concept of competency and currency because he does not possess the expertise. In order to go and get her on this diet, he would have needed a whole bunch of different ingredients, including collaborating with people who have professional expertise beyond him. He didn't do that. And he didn't offer her a choice in an area that was clearly her choice. So you could argue that he had not empowered her. You might even start to argue that there's a small violation or some evidence of a violation of body privacy here because this is something she's putting into her body, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. I said to you that there was potentially an example here of something upheld, and that example is that Andy was open about it, which meant he was accountable. And this is a fairly common thing. Just because somebody has done something wrong doesn't mean that they will later on continue to do the wrong thing. And the best thing we can do as professionals if we do make a mistake is be accountable and open towards others when they start looking into it. And that's exactly what Andy did in this scenario. All right, we're going to do a whole bunch more case examples in the next video, but that's going to wrap this one up.